They called it a miracle, and in the specific sense that the word implies an outcome that should not have been possible given the circumstances that produced it. The description is accurate. 400,000 men, the entire British expeditionary force and the remnants of the French and the Belgian armies that had fought alongside it, were trapped on a beach on the northern coast of France with the most powerful military force in the world closing in on them from 3 sides and the English Channel at their backs. The German army was 40 miles from the beach, then 30, then 20, then it stopped. That stop, the Halt order issued to German armored forces on May 24 th. 1940, is one of the most debated and the most consequential command decisions of the entire Second World War. It gave the trapped Allied forces 3 days in which to organize a defense, to prepare the beaches, and to begin the evacuation that would save enough of those 400,000 men to give Britain the army it needed to continue fighting. Without the Halt order, there is no more realistic scenario in which the evacuation succeeds before the German forces reach the beach. Without the evacuation, there is no more British army capable of defending the homeland against the invasion that Hitler was then planning. Without that defense, everything that followed, North Africa, Italy, Normandy, the entire Western campaign that ended German power in Europe in 1945, is at the very least delayed and at the worst never happens. The miracle of Dunkirk was not the little ships, though the little ships are a real and the important part of the story. The miracle was the Halt order. And the Halt order is not a miracle in the sense of being inexplicable. It has explanations. Multiple explanations. Actually, each of them supported by evidence and none of them entirely satisfying on its own, which is part of why historians have been arguing about it since the summer of 1940 and show no more signs of reaching consensus. This is the real story behind the miracle, not the version that fits on a beach with small boats and the white cliffs of Dover in the background. The version that explains why 338,000 men got to go home. To understand Dunkirk, you have to understand what happened in the 3 weeks before the evacuation. Because the situation on the beach was the product of a military collapse so rapid and so comprehensive that it had no more precedent in the history of modern warfare. The French campaign of May 1940 was not a close battle that gradually tipped in Germany's favor. It was one of the most catastrophic and one-sided military defeats in European history, a campaign in which the Allied forces, which were not inferior to the Germans in numbers or in main categories of equipment, were destroyed as an effective fighting force in approximately 6 weeks. The specific instrument of the destruction was the Manstein Plan, the German operational concept that Field Marshal Erich von Manstein had proposed and that Hitler had adopted over the initial objections of the German army's senior leadership. The original German plan for the invasion of France, Volljab, was a variation of the First World War's Schlieffen Plan, a sweep through Belgium and the Netherlands with the main force, designed to push the Allied armies back and to take the Channel ports. It was a plan that the Allied command expected, had prepared for, and was positioned to resist. Manstein proposed something different. He proposed concentrating the main German armored force not in the northern thrust through Belgium but in a thrust through the Ardennes forest, the supposedly impassable terrain in southern Belgium and the Luxembourg that Allied planning had assessed as a sector where light screening forces would be sufficient because no more serious attack was expected, sir. If the armored force could push through the Ardennes quickly, cross the Meuse River at Sedan, and then drive northwest toward the Channel coast, it would shoot off from behind the Allied forces that had advanced into Belgium to meet the expected German thrust in the north. The Ardennes crossing worked beyond anything Manstein had projected. The German armored forces, led by generals like Heinz Guderian and Owen Rommel, moved faster than their own headquarters believed was possible, faster than the logistics that were supposed to support them could maintain, faster than the Allied command could process and respond to. The Panzers crossed the Meuse at Sedan on May 13. By May 20, they had reached the Channel coast at Abbeville, physically cutting the Allied forces in France in two. The British Expeditionary Force, the French First Army, and the Belgian Army were in a pocket in northern France and Belgium, separated from the main French forces to the south by a corridor of German armor 70 miles long. The British commander, General Lord Gort, understood the situation faster than his French counterpart and with less emotional investment in the possibility that the German breakthrough was temporary or recoverable. Gort had visited his forward units, had seen what the German forces were doing, and by May 19 had concluded privately that evacuation by sea might be the only option. This was not a conclusion he was supposed to reach. The Allied command structure required him to coordinate with the French, and the French High Command under General Weygand was still insisting as late as May 21 Street and 22 ND that a coordinated Allied counterattack could restore the situation. The Weygand plan, the projected counterattack north and south against the German corridor that was supposed to re-establish Allied ground communications, existed primarily as a plan. The forces to execute it did not exist in the positions and the conditions required. And the German forces holding the corridor were too strong to be chewed by the available Allied units even if they had been able to coordinate the attack. The decision to begin planning for evacuation was made in London before Gort made it in the field. Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay, operating from the tunnels beneath Dover Castle, was tasked on May 20 with examining what it would take to evacuate the Bay F from the northern French ports. The operation that Ramsay began planning in the tunnels beneath Dover on May 20, which was given the codename Operation Dynamo, was conceived as an emergency measure that would, under optimistic projections, rescue perhaps 45,000 men before German forces reached the beaches. The final number of 338,000 rescued is 10 times the optimistic projection, and the gap between the two numbers is the measure of everything that had to go right and demand things that were wrong for the actual outcome to occur. The Halt order arrived at the German armored units on May 24. The Panzers, which had been advancing with a speed and the success that was generating genuine concern among the German army's high command about overextension and the vulnerable flanks, were ordered to stop at the Canal line and to hold their positions. The Luftwaffe would neutralize the Allied forces at Dunkirk. The infantry would advance to clean up what the Luftwaffe left. Who gave the Halt order and why are questions that the historical record has not fully resolved. Hitler's war diary records his approval of the order. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding Army Group A, which included the main armored forces, had requested a post to allow the infantry to close up and to give the tank crews and their vehicles some relief from the path of the advance. General Genscher von Kluge had expressed concern about the exposed southern flank of the armored corridor. Hermann Göring had lobbied Hitler for the opportunity to demonstrate what the Luftwaffe could do against an enemy that had its back to the sea and could not maneuver. The popular historical narrative has attributed the Halt order primarily to Hitler's personal intervention, and some historians have argued that Hitler may have had political reasons for the Halt. A desire to offer Britain terms and to preserve its capacity as a potential ally rather than humiliating it completely by capturing or destroying its entire army. This interpretation has been contested by historians who argue that there is insufficient documentary evidence for Hitler's specific reasoning, and that the military rationale for the Halt order was genuine and sufficient without requiring any political explanation. What is not contested is the consequence. 3 days. The Allies used 3 days to establish a defensive perimeter around Dunkirk, to organize the beaches for embarkation, and to begin the naval operation that would determine how men survived. The perimeter, held by increasingly exhausted British and the French forces against German pressure on three sides, had to be maintained for the entire 9 days of the evacuation, and the men who held it, including the French rearguard forces who held it long enough for the British to evacuate, and then were captured when the evacuation ended, are a part of the Dunkirk story that the British national myth has not always accommodated as fully as it should. The evacuation itself, Operation Dynamo, began on the evening of May 26 TH, 1940, and continued until June 4 TH, 9 days in which the combination of Royal Navy destroyers, merchant vessels, fishing boats, pleasure craft, and every other floating thing that could cross the channel was employed in the largest emergency sea lift in history. The famous little ships, the collection of small privately owned vessels that crossed the channel to assist in the evacuation, are real, documented, and genuinely important in specific ways that their legendary status in British national memory has sometimes distorted. The majority of the men evacuated from Dunkirk were taken off by Royal Navy destroyers and the other military vessels. The little ships, the pleasure boats and the fishing vessels and the lifeboats and the paddle steamers, served primarily as ferries between the beach and the larger ships offshore, transporting men from the shallow water where the large ships could not approach to the deeper water where the naval vessels waited. This was an important function. The beaches at Dunkirk were very shallow, and the inability of large ships to come close to shore was a significant logistical constraint on the rate of embarkation. The small boats that could navigate the shallow water became the connection between the men on the beach and the ships that could carry large numbers of men across the channel. But the transformation of the little ships from logistical auxiliaries into the primary symbol of the evacuation, the images British civilians spontaneously rising to save their soldiers with their private boats, is a simplification of a more complicated reality. Many of the small vessels were commandeered by the Admiralty rather than volunteered by their owners. Many were sailed by naval personnel rather than their private owners. Some of the private owners who did sail their own boats to Dunkirk had no more idea what they were getting into and experienced the specific shock of discovering that the channel was not a pastoral rescue operation that the distance from the beach suggested, but an active naval combat zone with enemy aircraft overhead and the ships sinking around them. The men waiting on the beaches for evacuation were experiencing conditions that the 9 days of Operation Dynamo produced in order of intensity and the despair that is difficult to convey without seeming to dramatize the undermapping. The men on the beach had been retreating and fighting for 3 weeks. Many of them had not slept for days. The food and the water and the ammunition had been consumed or abandoned in the retreat. They stood in the sea to their waists or their chests, in queues that extended down the beach for hundreds of meters, waiting for boats that might or might not come, while German aircraft bombed and strafed the beaches and the ships offshore and the town of Dunkirk burned with a black smoke that was visible from the English coast. The bombing was less effective than it should have been and less effective than Göring had promised Hitler it would be. The Luftwaffe flew thousands of sorties over Dunkirk during the 9 days of the evacuation, but the combination of the soft beach sand that absorbed bomb blasts without the lethal fragmentation that hard surfaces produce, the distance from the main Luftwaffe airfields that reduced the time aircraft could spend over the target, and the rough fighter patrols that were maintained over the beaches at considerable cost to fighter command's available strength, prevented the aerial interdiction from stopping the evacuation. The men on the beaches saw little of the rough overhead and in many cases believed bitterly and inaccurately, that the Air Force had abandoned them. They were not abandoned. The RAF was fighting above the cloud cover that made the fighter battles invisible from the beach. And it was paying a significant price in aircraft and the pilots to maintain the patrols that kept the evacuation from being even more costly than it was. The naval cost of Operation Dynamo was significant. 6 destroyers were sunk by German air at the core by mines. Many more were damaged. Several dozen smaller vessels were sunk. The toll on the ships and on the naval personnel who manned them was considerable, and the decision made by the Admiralty partway through the evacuation to withdraw the newer destroyers from the operation and limited the older vessels whose loss could be better absorbed reflected a genuine calculation about the long-term consequences of destroying the destroyer force on which Britain's naval defense depended. The French dimension of Dunkirk is the part of the story that the British national myth has been slowest to incorporate and that French historical memory has carried with the specific bitterness of people who feel they were used and then abandoned. The French forces that fought in the rearguard, holding the perimeter so that the evacuation could continue. And the French soldiers who were evacuated in the later days of the operation are a part of the story. The French First Army, which maintained the southeastern perimeter at Lille for 4 days after the main evacuation had begun, tying down 7 German divisions and allowing the beach operation to continue, is a contribution to the Dunkirk outcome that deserves more prominence than it typically receives in the British telling of the story. The British evacuation prioritized British troops over French troops in ways that the political relationship between the two governments made necessary, but that the men on the beaches experienced as a straightforward hierarchy of national interest. Churchill was aware of the political problem this created and he instructed that the evacuation should proceed on equal terms between British and the French forces. But the practical reality of the operation, with British officers making moment-by-moment decisions about who got on which boat, did not always reflect this instruction. The French forces that were ultimately captured at Dunkirk when the evacuation ended on June 4 included men who had held the perimeter to the last and who had therefore been last in the queue for embarkation. The aftermath of Dunkirk was managed in Britain with a combination of genuine relief at the scale of the rescue and the careful political handling of what it meant strategically. The return of 338,000 men was framed as a victory, and in the specific sense that it was a survival rather than an annihilation, it was. But those men had lost all their equipment, virtually all the BEF's tanks, artillery, vehicles, and the heavy weapons in the retreat and on the beaches. They were survivors without weapons, and the British army that had been evacuated was, in the immediate term, incapable of defending Britain against the invasion that German planning was already beginning to contemplate. Churchill's speech to the House of Commons on June 4, 1940, the speech that ended with the promise to fight on the beaches and in the fields and in the streets and never surrender, is one of the most famous political speeches in English history. It is important to hear it in its full context. The speech was also an explicit warning that what had happened was a defeat, that wars are not won by evacuations, that the rescue of the army was not a victory but the preservation of the means to continue fighting. Churchill was simultaneously celebrating survival and refusing to allow that survival to be mistaken for anything other than the narrow escape from catastrophe that it actually was. The German commanders who watched the evacuation proceed from their halt positions were, in many cases, bewildered and frustrated by the order that kept them in place while the Allied forces escaped across the water. Guderian, commanding the 19th Panzer Corps, had written that his forces could have been at Dunkirk within a day of reaching the A Canal if they had been allowed to continue. The opportunity that the Halt order created, and that the evacuation exploited, was in retrospect visible to the German commanders as one of the decisive failures of the Western campaign, though a failure whose specific causes they attributed variously to Hitler's intervention, Göring's assurances, and the genuine tactical concerns about overextension that had influenced Randstad's request for the pause. The psychological and the political impact of Dunkirk on Britain was complex and in some ways contradictory. The evacuation provided a narrative of resilience and the collective purpose that the British government needed desperately in the summer of 1940, when the strategic situation was, objectively, extremely bleak. France surrendered on June 22 ND. Britain stood alone. The invasion appeared imminent. The army that had been rescued had no more weapons. The RAF was outnumbered. The Royal Navy was stretched to its limits. In that context, the Dunkirk narrative served a specific political function. It provided evidence that the British people could be told they had survived the worst and they had shown what they were made of. It provided a foundation for the argument that survival was possible and that the continuation of the fight was not hopeless. It was not falsification of the historical record. It was selective emphasis of the elements of a genuinely terrible event that supported the psychological and the political requirements of a country that needed to believe it could continue. That selective emphasis has shaped the public understanding of Dunkirk ever since. The little ships are remembered more clearly than the Royal Navy destroyers. The miraculous rescue is remembered more clearly than the military catastrophe that made it necessary. The men on the beaches are remembered as enduring with British stoicism, which many of them did, more clearly than the breakdown in discipline, the abandoned vehicles, and the occasional incidents of soldiers forcing their way onto boats ahead of others, which also happened with the accounts of the period document without drama. The beaches at Dunkirk today are unremarkable. They are a beach town on the northern coast of France. The summer tourism shaped by the same channel weather that made the evacuation simultaneously easier, the relative calm of the sea during much of the 9 days, and the harder, the threat of fire attack visible from the beach in a sky that was never fully clear of danger. The memorials are set and they are visited, though not with the same intensity of pilgrimage that Normandy receives. What the beaches remember that the memorials cannot fully convey is the specific quality of wading. Wading in water, wading in sand, wading in a queue that stretched further than you could see and that moved at a pace that made the calculation of whether you would reach the boats before the Germans reached the beach a calculation you could not stop making. Waiting in the specific condition of a man who has been fighting for 3 weeks and retreating for 2 weeks and standing in the channel for hours and who does not know if the boat he can see in the distance is coming toward him or toward someone else. 338,000 men got on boats. More than 60,000 did not. The French rearguard that Halt the perimeter is largely in French soil. The men of the Dunkirk evacuation whose names are on British memorials are served because the Halt order gave them time, and the small boats gave them passage, and the naval officers and the beachmasters and the men who held the perimeter gave them the chance that the military situation side they should not have had. Churchill was right. It was not a victory. It was a survival. But survival, in May 1940, was the only thing that mattered. And the survival was not a miracle in the sense of being random or inexplicable. It was the product of specific decisions, specific failures, specific acts of courage and the endurance and the organization by specific people, all converging on a beach on the northern coast of France over 9 days in the last spring of the last year before everything got worse before it began to get better. The channel is still there. It is always cold and it is frequently gray and the wind across it tastes of salt in a way that is specific to that body of water. The specific south of the narrow sea that has always been Britain's first line of defense ended that was, in the summer of 1940, also Britain's last line of everything. The little ships that crossed it are mostly gone now, the wooden hulls having reached the end of their natural lives in the decades since the crashing that made them famous. Some are preserved as museum pieces, their names on plaques in institutions that understand what they represent. Most simply wore out and they were broken up, their contribution to the outcome of the Second World War unannounced by their ending. The sea they crossed is unchanged. It does not know what it carried in the last days of May and the first days of June 1940. The weight of an army and a nation's survival in the shallow holds of fishing boats and the pleasure cruisers sailing in the dark toward a bit that was on fire. But we know, and the knowing is the obligation that the living carry toward the dead who made the knowing possible.